What happens when a man's greatest asset becomes his most feared enemy? Tonight we delve into the glittering, treacherous world of the super-rich, where loyalty is a commodity and love is a weapon. We'll witness the story of Richard Sterling, a titan of industry, who believed he could have it all, the perfect wife, who built his social empire, and the beautiful mistress to decorate his arm. He brought his secret into the light at the most prestigious event of the year, expecting the world to bow. But he forgot one crucial detail. The woman he scorned was not a doll in a gilded cage. She was a queen, and she was coming to collect her kingdom. This is the story of a public humiliation, a devastating betrayal, and a revenge so spectacular it would shatter an empire. The air in the Sterling penthouse overlooking Central Park was so still, so perfectly climate-controlled, it felt like a mausoleum. It was beautiful, of course. Everything Richard Sterling owned was beautiful. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering jewels of the Manhattan skyline. The walls were adorned with original Rothkos and Pollock's investments, as much as art. But for Serafina Sterling, it had long ceased to be a home. It was a headquarters, a stage, and tonight it was a battleground she was preparing to leave. She stood before a triptych of mirrors in her sprawling dressing room, a space larger than most New York apartments. The dress laid out on the chaise lounge was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk, by a designer so exclusive one did not simply buy his gowns, one was granted them. It was elegant, understated, and powerful. It was everything Serafina was. "Is that what you're wearing?" Richard's voice, smooth and condescending, cut through the silence. He stood in the doorway already in his bespoke tuxedo. He wasn't looking at her, but at her reflection, his eyes scanning the dress with faint disapproval. At 45, Richard Sterling was the picture of success. Sharp jaw, meticulously styled silvering hair, and the predatory stillness of a man who had never been told no. "It's the Sterling Foundation Gala, Richard, not a premiere." Serafina replied, her voice calm, betraying none of the acid churning in her stomach. "Subtlety is the keynote. Subtlety is for the audience, darling, not the hosts," he said, finally walking in. He adjusted his cufflinks, a gift from her father. "I was thinking of something grander for you. Something that says we are untouchable. We." The word was a lie. There hadn't been a we in years. There was Richard, and there was Serafina, the chief architect of the Sterling social dynasty. He had the money, or rather he had the talent for leveraging other people's money. But she had the lineage. She was a Blackwood. Her family hadn't just come over on the Mayflower. They had practically financed the voyage. It was her name, her connections, and her impeccable taste that had transformed Richard from a ruthless, if brilliant upstart into a member of the city's unshakable elite. The Sterling Foundation. Gala, the jewel of the city's philanthropic season, was her creation. "I believe this dress makes its point perfectly," she said, turning to face him. He sighed a theatrical sound of paternal disappointment he had perfected. "Fine. Just don't be outshone. I have an image to maintain." He glanced at his Patek Philippe watch. "The car is downstairs. I'm heading down now. I have to greet Marcus Thorne before he gets cornered by the press." He didn't offer to wait. He didn't compliment her. He didn't touch her. He simply issued his veiled commands and left the scent of his expensive cloying cologne lingering in the air like a ghost. As soon as the elevator doors chimed shut in the distance, Serafina's composure dissolved. She walked not to the dress, but to a hidden safe behind a framed print of a Monet. Her fingers steady and sure, keyed in the code. Inside, nestled on black velvet, were dozens of jewels. But she ignored them all. She reached further back to a secondary far older box made of worn cherry wood. Inside was a single piece. It wasn't just a necklace. It was a legend. The Star of Alexandria. A cascade of impossibly large, flawless blue-white diamonds centered around a single pear-cut stone, the size of a robin's egg. It was a Blackwood heirloom, last worn by her great-grandmother a century ago. It was a piece of such historical significance and staggering value that its existence was more myth than fact to the outside world. It was a statement of old-world power that made new money look like children's playthings. Richard had once asked about it years ago, when their marriage still had the veneer of a partnership. She had told him it was in a Swiss vault, too priceless to be kept in the city. Another lie in a marriage built on them. She lifted it from its velvet bed. The diamonds were cold against her skin, heavy with the weight of generations. Richard wanted her to look grand. He wanted to project an image of being untouchable. She smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. He had no idea what was coming. He thought tonight was his victory lap. He thought he was bringing a new, shiny decoration to his party. He was about to learn that you do not dismiss the woman who built the throne you're sitting on. Tonight she wasn't just going to outshine his little spectacle. She was going to eclipse it entirely. 2 miles away in a sleek, soullessly modern apartment in Hudson Yards that Richard paid for Kimberly Shaw was also preparing for war, though in her mind it was a coronation. She twirled in front of her own mirror, her reflection beaming back. She was 26, with a mane of bottle-blonde hair, a body sculpted by discipline and a surgeon's knife, and an ambition so sharp it was a weapon. The dress she wore was the antithesis of Seraphina's, a screaming scarlet number sequined and cut so low it was a dare. It was a dress designed to be noticed, to be talked about, to be photographed. "Oh, you are a vision," she whispered to her reflection, practicing the pout that she knew drove photographers wild. On her neck was Richard's latest gift, a necklace of canary yellow diamonds, ostentatious and loud. It was fabulously expensive, a headline grabber. Kimberly loved it. To her, it was a promise, a down payment on the life she was owed. Her phone buzzed. It was Richard. A single text on my way down. "Be ready." Kimberly's heart did a little flutter kick. Not of love, but of triumph. For 6 months she had been Richard Sterling's secret. His late-night board meetings, his impromptu business trips. She had played the game perfectly. She was fun where Seraphina was serious. She was spontaneous where Seraphina was reserved. She was, in her own estimation, everything a powerful man truly wanted when the pretense was stripped away. Tonight was her coming-out party. Richard had finally agreed. It's time, he'd said over dinner at a private club last week. It's time people saw who I'm really with. Seraphina. She's become a part of the institution. She's more of a CEO than a wife. You're alive. You make me feel alive. Kimberly had soaked it all up. She had convinced herself that Seraphina was a frigid, boring relic that Richard was trapped with for appearances. An arrangement. She had no idea of the ironclad prenuptial agreement, nor the fact that the Blackwood family's holding company was the single largest investor in Richard's flagship tech fund. She saw Seraphina's photo in Vogue and Town and Country. and saw a woman who was passionless and plain, not one who was playing a long, calculated game of chess. Her best friend, Tiffany, a fellow traveler in the world of securing wealthy benefactors, had been skeptical. "Are you sure about this, Kim?" she'd asked over the phone an hour ago. Walking into her event on his arm. "That's not just a statement. That's a declaration of war. These old money wives, they don't just get mad. They get even. They're vicious. She won't do anything." Kimberly had scoffed, applying a final layer of lip gloss. What can she do? Make a scene in front of the mayor, in front of the Davenports and the Rothschilds. Please. She's too concerned with appearances. She'll smile, freeze him out, and her lawyers will call his lawyers on Monday. By then the story will be out. Richard Sterling has a new woman. I'll be the talk of the town. Tiffany had been quiet for a moment. There are different kinds of scenes, Kim. The quiet ones are the most brutal. But Kimberly had dismissed it as jealousy. Tonight was her night. She would walk into that ballroom on the arm of the most powerful man in the room. The whispers would follow her. The flashbulbs would pop. She would be gracious and charming. She would be the vibrant modern woman who had finally captured the heart of Richard Sterling. The intercom buzzed. Richard's driver. She took one last look in the mirror, adjusting the yellow diamond necklace. It felt a little gaudy, a little heavy. But it was the price of admission. She imagined Seraphina Sterling in her tasteful, boring dress, probably pearls. The poor woman had no idea her entire world was about to be publicly and irrevocably dismantled. Kimberly smiled. Let the games begin. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a symphony of power. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, rained down light on a sea of black tie and couture. The air hummed with the low murmur of 1,000 conversations. Each one, a potential deal, a potential alliance, a potential scandal. This was Seraphina's masterpiece. Every detail, from the floral arrangements of white orchids to the Michelin-starred chef personally overseeing the kitchens, had been curated by her. This was her home turf. Richard Sterling made his entrance precisely at 8 o'clock, the peak time for arrivals, and he was not alone. On his arm, shimmering in scarlet and dripping with canary diamonds, was Kimberly Shaw. A ripple went through the room. It wasn't a gasp, not among this crowd. It was more subtle. A sudden pause in a conversation. The clinking of a champagne flute set down a little too quickly. The discreet turn of a head. Eyes that widened for a fraction of a second before being masked with polite indifference. This was not just a date. This was a public execution. To bring a mistress to the gala, founded and chaired by one's wife, was an act of social terrorism. Beatrice Davenport, the undisputed queen of New York society, whose nod could make or break a reputation, lowered her opera glasses. Her lips thinned into a razor line. Well, she murmured to her husband, Richard has finally lost his mind. He's forgotten who holds the purse strings. Richard, however, was high on his own audacity. He mistook the stunned silence for awe. He saw the turning heads and saw them as admiration for his boldness. He beamed, holding Kimberly's hand a little tighter, guiding her through the throng. Kimberly was in heaven. This was it. Every stare, every whisper was a confirmation of her new status. She felt like a movie star on the red carpet. She smiled brightly, nodding at people she didn't know, blissfully unaware that their polite smiles were masks for cold, calculating judgment. They weren't looking at her as Richard's future. They were looking at her as the garish, temporary distraction that had finally pushed a powerful man off a cliff. "Everyone is staring," she whispered to Richard. Giddy. "Let them stare," he said, his voice a low growl of satisfaction. He spotted Marcus Thorne, his biggest business rival, across the room. Thorne's eyes met his, and the man gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a look that was part pity, part disbelief. Richard interpreted it as fear. They settled at the head table, the one clearly marked for Mr. and Mrs. Richard Sterling. Kimberly's breath hitched as she saw the place card. With a flick of his wrist, Richard took Seraphina's card and, without even looking at it, tucked it into his pocket. He then guided Kimberly to the seat of honor. The message could not have been clearer. The Queen was deposed. Now the whispers grew louder. Where was Seraphina? Had she known? Was she at home, crying? Had she been sent away to the Hamptons, banished before the coup? The speculation was rampant. Richard was enjoying it, letting the drama build. He ordered champagne, leaning in to whisper in Kimberly's ear, making her laugh a little too loudly. Her laugh, sharp and shrill, echoed in the suddenly quiet opinion around their table. People nearby fell silent, turning away with second-hand embarrassment. "She has a laugh like a fire engine," Beatrice Davenport muttered, not bothering to lower her voice. Kimberly didn't care. She felt the power of the moment coursing through her. She had won. She had taken it all. The man, the position, the glory. In her mind, the story was already written. The papers tomorrow would be filled with photos of her and Richard, the new power couple. Seraphina Sterling would be a footnote. A yesterday. The orchestra conductor tapped his baton, ready to begin the evening's official program. The chairman of the museum was walking to the podium to deliver the welcoming remarks. It was the moment Richard had been waiting for, the official start of the evening, which would cement his and Kimberly's presence and force everyone to accept the new reality. And then it happened. The grand double doors at the far end of the ballroom, which had been closed since the cocktail hour ended, swung open, not by a doorman, but pushed wide by two attendants in white gloves, as if heralding a royal arrival. A hush didn't fall over the room. It crashed. A wave of silence rolled from the back of the ballroom to the front, snuffing out conversations and music in its path. Every single head turned. Kimberly, annoyed by the interruption, turned too. Richard, a smug smile on his face, followed her gaze. His smile vanished. It didn't just fade. It was wiped from his face, replaced by a mask of utter blood-drained shock. There, framed in the magnificent archway, stood Seraphina Sterling. She was not wearing the understated midnight blue gown. She was wearing her armor. It was a dress of liquid silver, a column of shimmering lamb that clung to her form like a second skin. It was both classic and terrifyingly modern. But no one was looking at the dress. They were looking at the diamonds. Around her throat, cascading over her collarbones, was the Star of Alexandria. It didn't just sparkle. It burned. It blazed with a cold blue-white fire, capturing the light from every chandelier and flinging it back 100-fold. The central stone, that impossible pear-cut diamond, pulsed partout like a living heart. It was a piece so magnificent, so overwhelmingly powerful. It made every other jewel in the room, including Kimberly's loud yellow diamonds, look like cheap glass trinkets. But it was more than the diamonds. It was the woman wearing them. Seraphina stood there for a long moment, her posture perfect, her chin high. She didn't look angry or hurt. She didn't look vengeful. She looked regal, like an empress who had arrived to survey her domain and found a minor squatter on her throne. Her gaze swept across the room, missing nothing, and yet acknowledging no one. And then the most incredible thing happened. Jonathan Blackwood, her father, a man whose quiet influence could make Wall Street tremble, rose from his table near the front. He was an old man, but he stood with the ramrod straightness of his military youth. He simply stood and looked at his daughter with pride. Then Beatrice Davenport rose, and her husband, then the mayor, then Marcus Thorne. Table by table, person by person, the most powerful and influential people in New York, in the country, got to their feet. It was not a polite, perfunctory standing ovation. It was a silent, unified show of fealty. They weren't standing for Mrs. Richard Sterling, the wronged wife. They were standing for Seraphina Blackwood, the daughter of a dynasty, the true source of power in the room. Richard remained frozen in his chair, his face ashen. He looked like he had been struck by lightning. This was not the plan. This was a nightmare. He had expected tears, a quiet retreat, a dignified surrender. He had not expected this display of overwhelming force. He hadn't just misjudged his wife. He had fundamentally misunderstood the game he was playing. He thought it was about money and dessous. He was just now realizing it was about bloodlines and power, and he was a rank amateur. Kimberly was paralyzed. The triumph had curdled into pure, unadulterated terror. The stares she had so enjoyed moments before were now daggers. The whispers were no longer about her arrival, but about her impending annihilation. She looked down at her gaudy dress, at her loud necklace. She felt cheap. She felt exposed. She felt for the first time like the fool Tiffany had tried to warn her she was. Her loud laugh was a distant, humiliating memory. Seraphina began to move. She didn't march. She glided. Her silver gown whispered over the marble floor. She walked past tables of her peers, offering a small, serene smile here, a slight, gracious nod there. She was acknowledging their support, reinforcing her position. She was a queen, moving through her court. And she was heading directly for the head table. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. He tried to stand, to say something, to intercept her, but his limbs wouldn't obey. Kimberly shrank back in her chair, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. Seraphina did not stop in front of Richard. She didn't even look at him. She walked past him and past Kimberly, stopping behind the empty chair next to her father at his table. Only then did she turn. Her eyes, cool and devastating, finally met Richard's across the few feet of open space. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her look said everything. You are a guest in my house. You are sitting at my table, and you have brought trash into my home. Then her gaze shifted, landing on Kimberly for the first time. It was not a look of anger or jealousy. It was a look of utter and complete dismissal, the kind of look one gives to an insect before crushing it. Seraphina raised her hand, not in a wave, but as a signal to the orchestra conductor, who had been standing frozen baton in mid-air. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. The conductor jolted back to life, tapped his baton, and the orchestra swelled, launching into a soaring Vivaldi piece. The program was beginning. The gala would continue. Her gala. The war was over. The victory had been absolute. and not a single word had been spoken. The rest of the evening unfolded like a masterfully orchestrated public shaming. Serafina, seated between her father and the French ambassador, became the gravitational center of the ballroom. A steady stream of the city's most influential figures made their way to her table, not to offer condolences, but to pay their respects. They spoke of the Foundation's new initiatives of art of politics. They spoke of everything and anything except the man and the woman, sitting in radioactive isolation at the head table. Richard and Kimberly were pariahs. No one approached them. The waiters seemed to hesitate before refilling their glasses. The air around their table was thick with a toxic silence. Richard, for the first time in his adult life, was irrelevant. He watched impotent as his wife held court effortlessly, charming the very people he needed to impress. He saw Marcus Thorne lean in and share a laugh with her, and a cold dread colder than any anger began to seep into his bones. This wasn't just social, it was business. Kimberly tried to brave it out. "Well, she's certainly putting on a show," she muttered, trying for a sarcastic tone. Richard turned on her, his voice a venomous whisper. "Shut up. Just shut your mouth. You have no idea what you're looking at." Her face fell. The man who had promised her the world was now looking at her with undisguised contempt. She was no longer a prize. She was a liability. The scarlet dress that had felt so bold and powerful now felt like a brand marking her as the fool who had gambled and lost spectacularly. The final humiliation came during the auction. The climax of the evening was always the auction of a single, priceless item. This year, it was a week-long stay on a private Caribbean island owned by a reclusive billionaire. The bidding was fierce, quickly climbing into the six figures. Richard saw an opportunity, a chance to reassert himself, to show he was still a player. He raised his paddle. 500,000, he called out, his voice loud, trying to command the room's attention. A few heads turned, but the bidding continued, instantly surpassing him. He bid again. 600. Then Serafina, who hadn't shown any interest, subtly lifted a single finger. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I have $1 million from Mrs. Blackwood Sterling's table." A collective gasp went through the room. Serafina gave a serene smile, as if she were bidding on a pastry. Richard was stunned. He couldn't match that. Not without leveraging assets he didn't want his board to know about. He had been publicly outbid, outpowered, and outclassed by his own wife. He lowered his paddle, his face burning with a shame so intense it was physical. The auction was over. Serafina had won, and the donation would be noted as coming from her, not him. Another subtle, surgical cut. As the evening began to wind down, Kimberly couldn't take it anymore. She saw Serafina standing near the terrace, speaking with Beatrice Davenport. Bolstered by 2 glasses of champagne and a desperate need to reclaim some sliver of dignity, she stood up and walked toward them. Richard hissed Kimberly. "Don't," but she ignored him. She approached the 2 women, forcing a brittle smile. "Serafina," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That's quite a necklace. You must be terrified of losing it." Beatrice Davenport's eyebrows shot into her hairline. She looked at Kimberly as if she were a piece of gum on her shoe. Serafina turned slowly, her expression unreadable. She looked Kimberly up and down, her gaze lingering for a moment on the garish yellow diamonds. "It's a family piece," Serafina said, her voice soft, yet carrying the chill of a winter morning. "One doesn't worry about losing things when they are an inseparable part of who you are. Unlike things that are merely rented. The insult was so precise, so devastating it struck Kimberly breathless. Beatrice let out a small, almost inaudible gasp of delighted horror. Kimberly felt the blood drain from her face. She had no response. There was nothing to say. She had brought a knife to a gunfight, only to find out her opponent commanded an entire army. She turned and practically fled, weaving through the crowd and out of the ballroom, leaving Richard alone at the table, a king dethroned in a kingdom that was never truly his. Serafina watched her go, her expression unchanged. She then turned back to Beatrice. Now, as I was saying about the museum's new wing, the war was over, but the demolition had just begun. The fallout was not a bomb blast. It was a poison, a slow-acting, meticulously engineered toxin that began its work in the silent pre-dawn hours of the morning after the gala. Richard awoke in the master bedroom of the penthouse, the sheets a tangled mess around him. His head throbbed from the scotch he had consumed in a desperate attempt to drown the image of Serafina's triumphant, diamond-clad entrance. For a moment in the hazy fugue state between sleep and consciousness, he allowed himself to believe it was a nightmare. Then he reached for his phone. The illusion shattered. He didn't need to search for the news. It found him. The digital edition of the New York Times had already updated its society section, scenes from the sterling gala. The lead photo was a masterpiece of narrative control. It was Serafina captured in a candid moment, laughing with the French ambassador. The star of Alexandria blazed at her throat, but the true brilliance was in her eyes. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly in her element. The caption was a eulogy to her leadership, Serafina Blackwood, chairwoman of the Sterling Foundation, celebrates another record-breaking year of philanthropic success. They had used her maiden name first, a subtle yet unmistakable signal. Richard scrolled frantically, a knot of acid tightening in his gut. He found the main article a glowing recap of the evening's opulence and charitable triumphs. He scanned the text, his name a conspicuous absence. Paragraph after paragraph detailed the guests, the auction, the decor, all of it Serafina's domain. Finally, buried deep within a lengthy paragraph, listing notable attendees, he found it. A single surgically precise sentence. Richard Sterling, the founder of Sterling Industries, was also in attendance. Not host, not co-chair, just an attendee. The past tense was a public shiv sliding between his ribs. He was an afterthought at his own event. In the official record of the night, he had been relegated to a footnote. He threw the phone onto the empty space beside him, the space where his wife should have been. The public neutering had begun. At precisely 9:01 a.m., his private line rang. It was Alan Connolly, his perpetually anxious chief financial officer. "Richard, thank God I reached you." Alan's voice was strained, the words tumbling out in a rush. "We have a 5-alarm fire. I just got off the phone with the legal department at Blackwood Holdings." "Settle down, Alan," Richard said, swinging his legs out of bed and trying to inject a commanding tone into his voice. "It's just Jonathan rattling his saber. He's angry. Call him back, offer a donation to his alumni fund. It will blow over." A beat of stunned silence on the other end. "Richard, this isn't about a donation. They've issued a formal margin call on the entire loan portfolio, the $300 million line of credit that backs our R&D and acquisitions fund." Richard froze the phone cold against his ear. That's insane. It's a legacy loan, a family arrangement." The family arrangement was backed by a contract with a standard demand clause. "Richard," Alan's voice was getting higher, And they've just demanded it. We have to post the full collateral or wire the cash equivalent. We have until market close on Friday. That's 72 hours. That's impossible. Richard stammered, his mind reeling. The company didn't have that kind of liquidity. No company did. That capital was leveraged 10 times over in long-term investments and acquisitions. Unwinding those positions would take months, and doing it under duress would mean catastrophic losses. It's a bluff, a scare tactic. Let me call Jonathan myself. He hung up on Alan and immediately dialed his father-in-law's private number. It went straight to a polite but firm assistant he didn't recognize. Mr. Blackwood is in strategic planning meetings for the foreseeable future and is not taking any unscheduled calls. If this is regarding the Sterling Industries portfolio, you are to direct all correspondence to his legal counsel at Sullivan and Cromwell. The line went dead. A cold dread, colder and more terrifying than any anger, began to seep into his bones. This wasn't a tantrum. This was a strategy. The gala hadn't been the main event. It was the declaration of war. The rest of the day was a cascade of failures. The dominoes, so carefully aligned over years of success, began to fall one after another with sickening speed. A call to his primary banker at J.P. Morgan, a man with whom he played golf every spring, was met with a chillingly professional tone. Richard, given the new information regarding your primary capital partner, we'll need to review our current exposure. I'm afraid the expansion of your credit line is on hold pending that review. An email arrived from a hedge fund manager who had verbally committed $50 million to his new AI venture a week ago. Dear Richard, due to unforeseen shifts in our internal strategy, we will be respectfully withdrawing our letter of intent. We wish you the best. The excuse was so flimsy it was insulting. At 2:30 p.m., a red banner flashed across his Bloomberg terminal. Thorne Consolidated announces 2.1B merger with German autonomous driving firm Autodrive GmbH. Richard stared at the screen, his blood turning to ice. Autodrive was the very company his team had urged him to acquire 3 months ago. He'd passed calling it overpriced, wanting to channel funds into a flashier, more speculative venture. A venture that was now dead in the water. Marcus Thorne hadn't just beaten him to the prize. He had waited, watched him become vulnerable, and then delivered the killing blow, seizing the narrative and positioning himself as the stable, forward-thinking visionary of their industry. His empire was crumbling, and it wasn't even dark yet. Blind with rage and a desperate need to blame someone other than himself, he left the office and drove straight to Kimberly's apartment. He used his own key, storming into the sterile, white-on-white space. She was on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, a picture of manufactured glamour, even in her distress. The scarlet dress from the gala was draped over a chair, a garish symbol of their shared folly. "This is your fault," he roared, the sound echoing off the minimalist surfaces. Kimberly jumped, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. "My fault? How is any of this my fault? You and your incessant pushing," he spat, pacing like a caged animal. "When are you going to take me public? Richie, when are you going to show everyone? You had to have your moment, didn't you? You had to be the star of the show." She stood up, her fear transmuting into fury. "Don't you dare put this on me. You loved it. You preened like a peacock in that ballroom. You told me she was a relic, a boring, passionless businesswoman you were trapped with for appearances. You fed me that story, and I was stupid enough to believe you. She is a boring businesswoman," he yelled, his voice cracking. "So boring she just checkmated my entire company. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to your boring wife and less time playing kingmaker with me, you wouldn't be in this mess," she shrieked back. "You lied to me, Richard. You told me you were in control, but you were never in control, were you? You were just a spoiled boy playing with her family's money. Her words struck a nerve so raw, it felt like a physical blow. He saw her then not as the vibrant, exciting creature he had desired, but as a cheap, tawdry mirror reflecting his own catastrophic misjudgment. She was a symptom of his disease. His rage collapsed into cold reptilian contempt. He walked to his briefcase, took out a checkbook, and wrote her a check for a sum that was obscene to her and meaningless to him. He tore it out and threw it on the marble coffee table. "The lease is paid for 3 more months," he said, his voice flat and dead. "This should cover your expenses after that. We're finished. Don't ever call me or any of my offices again." He turned and walked out without a backward glance, leaving her standing amidst the ruins of her fantasy, the check, a final insulting testament to the purely transactional nature of their affair. The next afternoon, battered and sleepless, Richard sat in his corner office, a general surveying a battlefield where all his armies had deserted. That's when his secretary, Martha, buzzed him, her voice trembling. "Sir, your wife is here to see you." A flicker of insane hope ignited within him. Was she here to call it off? Had she made her point? Was she here to negotiate the terms of his surrender? "Send her in," he said, straightening his tie, a futile gesture of defiance. Serafina entered. She was not the regal empress from the Gala, nor the quiet wife from the penthouse. Today she was a predator in a charcoal grey suit, her hair pulled back in a severe chignon. She was flanked by the 2 lawyers from her father's firm, their expressions giving away nothing. They were here not for a reconciliation, but for a closing. She walked directly to his desk, her heels clicking with metronomic purpose on the hardwood floor. She placed a thick bound file in the center of his desk. It landed with a soft final thud. "Richard," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion, a surgeon stating a diagnosis. "This is a tender offer." He stared at the document, the title emblazoned on the cover. "Proposal for the acquisition of a controlling interest in Sterling Industries by Blackwood Holdings, LLC. What is this?" he whispered, though he already knew. "It's quite simple," Serafina explained, her eyes as cold and clear as glass. "The margin call was a catalyst designed to expose the fundamental instability of your leadership to the market. Your stock price has fallen 38% in 48 hours. My father's consortium is now making an offer to buy a controlling stake. It's priced at a generous premium over yesterday's close. The offer will save the company, protect the thousands of employees from your recklessness, and most importantly, safeguard my family's foundational investment." She leaned forward, her hands resting on the back of a visitor's chair. "You thought I was a decoration, didn't you, Richard? A social asset to be managed. The woman who picked the caterers and approved the flower arrangements. You took credit for the connections my name provided and dismissed the financial advice I gave. You stood on a foundation I built and believed you were the architect." Her voice dropped, becoming even quieter, yet more intense. "You hosted clients in our home and never once mentioned I was the one who spotted the flaw in their Q2 earnings report. You accepted an award for the Sterling Foundation and never acknowledged I was the one who structured the endowment. You wanted a beautiful, silent partner. But you failed to realize that silence is not absence. It is observation. And I have been observing you for a very long time." She straightened up, her work done. "The board has been briefed. My father holds the proxies for 40% of the voting shares. This is a formality. I suggest you take the offer. It's the only dignified exit you have left." He looked at her, at the woman he had lived with for 15 years, and saw a complete stranger. A brilliant, ruthless strategist who had been patiently waiting, gathering her forces while he had been distracted by shiny, disposable things. He hadn't just lost a fight. He was just now realizing he had been a casualty in a war that she had won before he even knew it had begun. The boardroom on the 50th floor of the Sterling Industries building was a place Richard had always considered his sanctuary, his throne room. The 20-foot-long table carved from a single piece of rare Brazilian rosewood had been his altar. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the steel and glass canyons of Manhattan had been his vista, a daily affirmation of his dominion. Today, it was his tomb. The air, usually humming with the energy of ambition and billion-dollar deals, was thick with a funereal silence. The polished surface of the table did not reflect a king surveying his court, but a condemned man surrounded by his executioners. He sat at the head of the table, a position he occupied by habit, but he held no authority. The 10 board members men he had hand-picked, golfed with, and whose children's weddings he had attended were arrayed down the sides. Not a single one would meet his gaze. Their eyes were fixed on their leather-bound portfolios, the damning documents within or on the figure at the far end of the table. Jonathan Blackwood. Jonathan sat flanked by 2 severe-looking lawyers from his firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, their faces impassive masks of corporate warfare. He wasn't gloating. He looked tired old and immensely sad, which was somehow far more terrifying than if he had been angry. He looked like a patriarch forced to put down a rabid dog that had once been a family pet. Richard cleared his throat, the small sound unnaturally loud in the vacuum of the room. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice straining for a composure he did not feel. "I understand there are concerns. The margin call from Blackwood Holdings was unexpected, a surprise tactic, but it is a temporary liquidity issue, nothing more. My plan to divest from the Pacific acquisitions will free up the necessary capital within the quarter." He was cut off not by a voice, but by a sound. One of the lawyers, a man named Peterson, slid a single sheet of paper down the polished table. It glided silently, frictionless, until it stopped directly in front of Richard. It was a stock chart for Sterling Industries. The line on the graph was not a slope. It was a cliff, a near vertical drop that had begun the Monday morning after the Gala. The market does not perceive this as a temporary liquidity issue. Mr. Sterling Peterson said, his voice as dry as old parchment. The market perceives it as a catastrophic loss of confidence. Your primary investor and financial backstop has, for reasons we need not detail in this room, withdrawn its support. Your largest competitor, Thorne Consolidated, announced its merger with a German tech firm yesterday, an acquisition you yourself passed on 3 months ago. The narrative is set. Sterling Industries under your leadership is seen as unstable, distracted, and fiscally compromised. Richard felt a hot flush of rage. This is a personal vendetta. Jonathan is using his position to punish me over a private matter. This is unethical. It is entirely contractual. Richard. Jonathan Blackwood spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble of finality. Every loan had a demand clause. Every investment had performance metrics. You breached the unspoken covenant of family, so I am exercising the explicit covenants of business. You built this company with my money on the foundation of my daughter's name. You have desecrated both. This is not punishment. This is a course correction. David Chen, a board member. Richard had mentored a man he'd considered a friend, finally looked up. His face was etched with a weary resignation. Richard, the offer on the table is our only viable path forward. Blackwood Holdings and their consortium are offering 33% above yesterday's closing price. It's more than generous. It saves the company. It protects the shareholders and the employees. If we refuse, the stock will be worthless by next week and will be carved up in bankruptcy court. So you're just rolling over. Richard slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing his desperation. This is my company. My name is on the building, a name which is now a liability. Peterson interjected coolly. He gestured to the thick file in front of him. The offer is contingent on your immediate resignation as chairman and CEO. The vote was a formality, a ritual of humiliation. The chairman pro tem, a stoic man named Caldwell, called the question. One by one the voices came. I. Each word was a nail in his coffin. Richard sat in stone-cold silence, the lone dissenter, by abstention. It was over. He had been surgically, bloodlessly, and unanimously excised from the image he had built. He signed the papers in a fugue state. His signature, once a bold, assertive scrawl, was now the shaky script of a broken man. As the board members filed out, offering him clipped, insincere condolences. Sorry it came to this, Richard. Best of luck in your future endeavors. He felt a profound and terrifying isolation. Finally, only he and Jonathan Blackwood remained. The old man walked slowly to the window, looking down at the city below. I remember when Serafina first brought you home, Jonathan said, his voice softer now, reflective. She saw something in you, a hunger, a brilliance. I saw it too. But I warned her. Hunger unchecked becomes gluttony, and gluttony destroys everything it touches. He turned to face Richard. You thought my daughter was an accessory to your ambition. You failed to understand she was the source of it. The access, the credibility, the stability, it all came from her, from us. You were a sterling, but only because she was a Blackwood. You forgot that. You thought the frame was more important than the masterpiece it held. Jonathan walked to the door. You should have known better, son, he said, his voice tinged with that same weary disappointment. You married a Blackwood. We don't get divorced. We acquire. He then turned and left Richard alone in the cavernous room, a deposed king in a silent, empty castle. Richard's walk from the boardroom to his office was the longest of his life. The news had already traveled through the corporate grapevine. Administrative assistants who once jumped to attention when he passed were now intensely focused on their computer screens. Executives who would have scrambled to catch his eye now ducked into conference rooms or turned a sudden corner. He was a ghost. His authority had evaporated, and with it, his very presence. His personal secretary, Martha, a woman who had managed his life for 15 years, was standing by her desk, her face pale. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice catching. The transitional team is here. They've asked that you only take your personal effects. The word transitional was another sterile blade. He walked into his office. Two stern-faced men in suits were already there, one taking inventory of the art, the other boxing the files on his desk. His space, his world, was being dismantled. He walked to the credenza where a silver-framed photo stood. It was of him and Serafina at a charity event 5 years ago. They were laughing. She looked genuinely happy, her head resting on his shoulder. He remembered that night. He had just closed the landmark deal that put Sterling Industries on the map. He'd told her, "We did it." We. When had he stopped saying that? He picked up the photo. "That's company property, sir," one of the men said, not unkindly. The frame was purchased by the facilities department. The petty indignity of it was staggering. He put the photo down and picked up the only other personal item there. A small, heavy crystal award from his first major success. He clutched it in his hand as he walked out, not looking back. The name on the building was still his, but the soul of the place had already cast him out. He didn't go to a hotel. He went home to the penthouse. The silence was absolute. The vast, art-filled rooms felt cold and alien. Every object had been chosen by Serafina. Every color palette, every texture was a reflection of her impeccable, understated taste. He had lived here for a decade, but he realized with a sickening lurch that he had only ever been a guest. Her things were gone. The closets in her dressing room were empty. The cherry wood box that had held the diamonds was gone from the safe. She had moved with the same silent, devastating efficiency with which she had taken his company. 2 weeks later, the business world was rocked by the official announcement. The newly restructured company, now operating under the streamlined name Blackwood Industries, had appointed its new chief executive officer. It was Serafina Blackwood. She was dropping the Sterling name entirely. Her official portrait released to the press was a masterstroke of rebranding. It was taken in the CEO's office, his office, but it looked entirely different. The heavy masculine furniture had been replaced with cleaner modern lines. She was seated in a simple but powerful chair, not behind the desk but perched on its edge, leaning forward as if in active conversation. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, no jewelry. Her expression was calm, focused, and formidable. She was not a socialite. She was not a wife. She was a leader in complete command. The accompanying article in the Wall Street Journal was effusive. It painted her not as the wronged wife taking revenge, but as the brilliant hidden asset who was always the true heir to the Blackwood financial dynasty. It detailed her degree in finance from Wharton, her early work on her father's portfolio management team, and her previously uncredited strategic role in several of Sterling Industries' most successful early ventures. The narrative was clear. This was not a hostile takeover. It was a restoration. The rightful ruler was finally on the throne. Meanwhile, Kimberly Shaw's world had shrunk to the size of her Hudson Yards apartment. Her phone had gone silent. The invitations stopped. The fair-weather friends who had flocked to her when she was Richard Sterling's mistress were now nowhere to be found. She was a social contagion. One afternoon, she saw Serafina's CEO portrait on the cover of Forbes. The headline was, "The Quiet Coup, How Serafina Blackwood Reclaimed Her Empire." Kimberly stared at the image of the woman she had so blithely dismissed. She saw the cool intelligence in her eyes, the unshakable confidence. She finally understood. She hadn't been competing with a wife. She had been a gnat buzzing in the face of a lioness. The next day, a formal eviction notice arrived from the building's new management company, a subsidiary of Blackwood Holdings. Richard's 3 months of rent was a severance package, and it was running out. Richard saw the same Forbes cover on a tablet screen in a sun-drenched, soulless hotel suite overlooking the Persian Gulf. He had fled to Dubai, a city of transient wealth and forgotten pasts, hoping to disappear. But there was no escaping the digital world. He read the article, and every word was a fresh torment. Analysts praised Serafina's first moves as CEO divesting from his reckless tech ventures, shoring up the company's core assets, and making a strategic alliance with, of all people, Marcus Thorne. He threw the tablet across the room where it shattered against a marble wall. He was 45 years old, fabulously wealthy by any normal standard, and utterly, completely finished. The money in his account was a settlement, a consolation prize. It was not power. He had traded true power, the partnership, the legacy, the dynasty he had been welcomed into, for a fleeting thrill, a cheap ego boost. He thought of that night at the Gala, of Kimberly's loud, grating laugh, filling the silence. He had brought her there to humiliate his wife, to show her she was being replaced. He sank into a chair, the Dubai skyline glittering meaninglessly before him. The terrible final irony settled upon him. He had succeeded. He had replaced his wife. In his office at the head of his company, on the masthead of his life. Serafina wasn't the wife anymore. She was the chairman. And he was nothing. Just a memory of a man who had once been married to a queen and had been foolish enough to think he was the king. And so Serafina Blackwood took back not just her dignity, but her entire destiny. Richard Sterling's story is a chilling reminder that the brightest fortunes can be built on the most fragile foundations, and that underestimating the person beside you can be the most expensive mistake of all. Serafina's victory wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclamation. She reclaimed her name, her power, and her life not with screams and tears, but with cold, calculated brilliance. Have you ever felt underestimated? Have you ever had to find the strength to fight a quiet battle no one else could see? Serafina's story shows us that true power isn't always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's the silent, strategic mind that wins the war. If this story of triumph and spectacular justice resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button. It truly helps the channel grow. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength. And for more stories of karma, revenge, and ultimate empowerment, make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for listening.